Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let some people join. We'll get started in a few minutes. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction and wait a few minutes while everyone enters. So firstly, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sheehan. I'm a member of the SCTA Next Gen Council. I also work for Teuton as a sustainability manager. So the webinar today, we're going to focus on the upcoming EU regulation. Our intention is to give you a basic understanding of the regulations coming into force in the European Union, specifically the ones that will affect the coffee industry, that's deforestation, due diligence, and forced labour. So we're going to hear from two experts on this subject today. We've invited, firstly, Isabel Lemons, who is the Sustainability Manager at the European Coffee Federation. Isabel has been at the forefront of ECF's engagement with the EU institutions on these regulations, and she's going to give us the basic overview of the upcoming regulations. She's going to be followed by Janina Grabs. Janina is an assistant professor at SCTA Business School in Barcelona, and she's also a published author. Her work focuses on the governance of sustainability in global value chains, such as coffee and palm oil. Janina is going to give us an interesting perspective on what we might expect for the future with a bit of hindsight from the palm oil industry. So as always, we're going to open up the Q&A function. It's there, it's open. So send us your questions and we'll try to answer them at the end. There's also Spanish translation available at the bottom. And before we get started, I just want to mention one thing. We've officially launched our Italy Espresso Tour for the 4th to the 6th of May. You can find all the information and access to register on our webpage. So it's about 4:05 now, so I think we should get started. I'm going to hand it over to Isabel first.
Thank you, Cheyenne, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Of course, it doesn't look like when we did the test. Okay, perfect. So yes, as Cheyenne mentioned, I'm going to give you an overview of 3 important pieces of legislation that are in the pipeline on the EU agenda. So just a quick word about what is ECF. So it's the European Coffee Federation. So we were created in 1981, and we are the single voice of the European coffee trade and industry. And we do promote the sector's common interests towards the EU. So we do have roasters, traders, decaffeinators, soluble coffee manufacturers, and warehouse keepers. So as members, we do have 16 national associations in 38 companies, and we speak for over 750 companies in total, representing a total import volume of 40 million coffee bags. Our role, so as the umbrella organization of coffee trade and industry, so we do facilitate the development of an environment in which our industry can meet the needs of consumers and society while competing effectively to ensure the resilience and long-term sustainability of the coffee supply chain. And so we do offer a transparent platform for dialogue, collaboration, and knowledge sharing for our members, always in a pre-competitive way. So just to give the political context for those impactful pieces of legislation that are in the pipeline, so it all gets back to the European Green Deal. So it was published by the European Commission in December 2019, and it has been redefined as the new EU growth strategy in order to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society. But the overarching goal is really to become the first climate neutral bloc by 2050. And so the idea is really to put Europe on the pathway to sustainability and to have a sustainable future. So in this Green Deal, there are more than 20 transformative initiatives, like major ones, such as the biodiversity strategy and the farm to fork. And under those 2, for example, several initiatives also arise. And so I'm going to give you like 4 examples among 3 we're going to discuss today. So in November 2021, the proposal for the deforestation-free regulation was published by the European Commission. In February 2022, the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence proposal, and then there was a proposal on sustainable use of plant protection products. And then in September 2022, the forced labor regulation proposal came up. There are many others, so those have like are really focusing on sustainability and do have an impact also on producing countries. So how does it work? In a nutshell, those legislative acts do follow the ordinary legislative procedure or co-decision. So a proposal is suggested by the European Commission, and then it has to be debated in the European Parliament and in the Council. Once those 2 institutions do have a negotiating positions, usually the 3 institutions will enter the trilogue negotiations. First, it's informal in order to reach a first reading agreement. There's no time limit there, but in case there is no agreement at the end of those negotiations, it goes in the 2nd reading, and then it gets to the 3rd reading. But 94% of the texts are approved in the 1st reading under this term. And so each compromise text has to be formally approved by the European Parliament and the Council. And then it enters into force after its publication in the European Union official journal. Why do I mention this? Because we're going to go and see the stages of the regulation, and especially the deforestation-free regulation. So the Commission in 2019 already came up with a communication to step up EU action to halt deforestation. So the objective of the EU was really to answer citizens' demands as Europeans asked to have deforestation-free products, to reduce the EU's contributions to global deforestation, as it has been assessed that the EU is a major contributor to deforestation worldwide, to lead the way at the global level. So they want to curb consumption-driven deforestation and also engage with different consuming countries. And they also want partner countries to step up protection of the forest on their territories. So through cooperation programs, benchmarking system, and market incentives. And on this part, it focuses more on producing countries. So what is the timeline? So this is why I mentioned the co-decision procedure. So the proposal was published in November 2021. In June 2022, the Council adopted its negotiating position. In September 22, the Parliament came up with its position. In December, they came up to a draft agreement text. So once the draft agreement text is approved, it has to go back to be officially approved in those two institutions. So it was approved in the responsible committee in the Parliament in January, and tomorrow there will be the vote in the plenary. We can expect that the text will be approved as it is, and so the publication and the entry into force would be in May, June this year, which means an entry into application of the main articles, including the due diligence regarding deforestation steps by end 2024, early 2025, and SMEs will have to apply those regulations 6 months later in June, provisionally, of course. So what are the main provisions in this deforestation regulation? So there are mandatory due diligence rules applicable to all operators placing the product on the EU market or exporting the products from the EU market. So in the text, there's a difference between operator and trader. So the operator is the natural, legal person that places the product on the market or exports it from the market, while the trader in the regulation sense, it's the person who makes the product available on the EU market. So it's already on the market and it makes it available. So only products that are deforestation free and legal would be allowed to be imported or exported from the EU market. And all those products would need to be covered by a due diligence statement. So I'm going to see if I can click. I'm going to show you what the due diligence statement looks like. So you have to fill in this statement and submit it to the customs system in order to receive a reference number that you will use afterwards. So you will need to have the name, address of the operator, so the one importing the product. And then a major point is that you will need to have the country of production and geolocation of all plots of land where the commodities were produced. And if it has been produced using several plots from different plots, then you will need the geolocation of all those plots of land in this due diligence statement. So this is why I want to stress. So there are actually 3 important criteria in order to be able to import. So it's deforestation free, legal according to the laws of the countries of production, and covered by a due diligence statement. So in the text, the definitions are based on internationally recognized definitions. So for example, for the forest definition, the EU based its definition on the FAO one. And there are several obligations. So as we mentioned, it's like due diligence, so applicable to operators and non-SME traders. Non-SME traders are considered more or less as operators in the text. So if we go to the main obligation, so first is the information requirement. So you have to prove that the products are deforestation free with this due diligence statement. You will have to keep this information for 5 years And here I would like to stress that the EU made clear that having certification schemes is not sufficient to comply with the regulation. The operator is considered as the one responsible and might use the information of the certification scheme, but might have to complete this information. So what did we mention with geolocation? So it's actually having one latitude and longitude point referring to the plot of land. And if the plot is more than 4 hectares, then you need to have sufficient geolocation points in order to shape the polygon of the farm. If there is deforestation or forest degradation in one of the given plots of land, automatically the products and commodities are disqualified. So they're not supposed to be entered the EU. The second step is the risk assessment. So you can import a country on the EU market only if it reveals that there's no or only negligible risk. And the third step is the risk mitigation measures. So the text provides some examples, such as audits, independent survey, and supporting compliance of suppliers, especially for smallholders, through capacity buildings and investment. And of course, all this will have to be reported on an annual basis for those operators that are not SMEs or natural persons. So if I go back, so yes, as mentioned, so there's like this idea of strict traceability linking to the commodity, to the plot of land where it is produced, and the legality aspect. So it has to be compliant with the law of the countries of production, including human and labor rights and free, prior, and informed consent. So as you can see, there are some aspects that might have a huge impact. So what are the commodities targeted in the text? So there are 7. So palm oil, soy, wood, cattle, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and derived products. So all products and commodities targeted are specifically listed in the Annex 1. So for coffee, it's the code 0901. You might notice here that actually soluble coffee is not in the scope of the regulation. And we have asked for soluble coffee to be included, but it might have been too late. So it might be included in the review of within 2 years. So the EU considers that it's a non-discriminatory regulation in the sense that it applies to domestically produced products and commodities, but also to the imported and exported commodities. It's intended to have a progressive scope. So it will cover forests first and some commodities, but the idea is really to update this on a regular basis. So the idea is to cover also other ecosystems and other commodities with time. The cutoff date for the deforestation-free criteria is the 31st of December 2020. This is aligned with the SDGs and other international standards. So there was really the willingness of the Commission in that sense and of the EU institutions to have a recent cutoff date, so that deforestation that happened before do not prevent those plots of land to be used like to import coffee in the EU. And the regulation also foresees a benchmarking system of the countries of production. So it will assign a risk level to the countries according to the risk of deforestation in that country. So for example, the standard risk will be the default one when the regulation enters into application. And then you will have low and high risk countries. So the rules will be different according to the level of risk of the country of production you're importing coffee from. So if it's imported from a low risk country, in theory, it's only, we'll go back to the first step of the due diligence procedure, so the information requirement. If it's from a standard and high risk country, then you will need the information requirement, the risk assessment, and the risk mitigation. Yes, as mentioned, it's so there's always a need to collect the information even for low-risk countries, and to provide a due diligence statement, but you will not have to assess and mitigate the risk. So the text also foresees a minimum level of inspections for member state authorities to perform. So there is no choice. It's like really a minimum level. So they have to respect this threshold. So it's 9% for high-risk countries, 3% for standard risk countries, and 1% for low-risk countries. Member states of the EU are expected to lay down the rules on the penalties, but the regulation gives examples and some framework to follow for this for those penalties. So the fines, for example, can represent like 4% of the total annual union-wide turnover in the financial year preceding the fining decision, which represents a very high fine. Confiscation of the commodity and products. So those are just examples, but then member states have to follow and to clearly define this. And then the competent authorities, in case the product is not compliant when they do perform the check, the cost can be reclaimed from the operator or trader that is like that is fined. So after 1 year of the entry into force, so which means like entry into force is expected in May, June this year. So mid 2024, the scope of the regulation will already expand to cover other wooded land. And then within 2 years, the scope will cover other ecosystems, commodities, products, and financial institutions. So they're going to assess over the years what commodities should be included as well in the scope. And the idea is really to have an evolving scope. And then within 5 years, there will be like a generic review, and they will assess other impacts, including the impacts on smallholder farmers. So for this, in the text, it does foresee that the European Commission has to step up cooperation with partner countries. So the Commission will have to engage with producing countries, and it also foresees an increased engagement with consumer countries. And we can see here that the Commission and the European Union is quite in negotiations with other countries, because there are some initiatives in the US, in China, Japan, Switzerland. They're talking about this kind of tools, and they're looking at different options to tackle deforestation as well. So what is the Commission expected to do now before the entry into application of the text? So they have to work on the register information system. So the system that will contain all the due diligence statement and will interconnect those statements with the customs authorities and also the competent authorities, in order to have like this link between all those aspects to perform the checks, and so that there is a real interconnectivity between the different institutions involved. They have to work on the benchmarking. So they have been in contact with producing countries to assess the level of risk in those countries. So the idea is to have this benchmarking by the entry into application. So as mentioned, when it enters into application, it has to be considered as standard, and then it should be immediately defined better according to the level of risk. They have to work on guidelines. So for operators and traders, for competent authorities, and on certain definitions. The regulation text is, let's say, it's kind of a shell, but then there is a lack of details in it. And so there's a real need for guidelines for all the operators and traders to know exactly what are expected from them. And as mentioned earlier, the impact assessment. So the first review will be on the other wooded land, the second review on the commodities, products, and financial institutions, and the third one on smallholders, trade facilitation tools, and circumvention in all those aspects and to see how the regulation is fit for purpose. So this is the first regulation that we've seen. As you can see, it went quite fast, the legislative process from in 2021 to, let's say, now mid-2023. So it's a rapid process. The second text that we're going to look at quickly is a much slower. So it's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So just to mention the difference between a regulation and a directive, a regulation is directly applicable to all member states in the same way. A directive, member states have to transpose it into the national legislation, and they have to comply with the objective, but they still have some margin to define exactly how they're going to reach that objective. So the CS3D, as it's nicknamed, so it was proposed by the European Commission early 2022. And then it was quite slow in the sense that in November 2022, there was the draft report in the jury committee, so the Legal Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. While at the level of member states, so the Council already adopted its general approach or its negotiating position end of November 2022. So now we're still waiting for the compromise amendments in the jury committee. So they have been working on this since November 2022, and we do expect the vote on the text to take place on the 25th of April this year. And then it would go in the plenary. All those dates are tentative. So it will go in the plenary on the 31st of May this year. And then it's expected to enter the trilogue negotiation on the second half of 2023, as soon as there's the Spanish presidency. So there's like a different country, a different member state taking the presidency of the Council every 6 months. And as of July, it will be Spain. So they expect the negotiations to start there with this new presidency and the end of the Swedish one. So what is this initiative aiming to do? So it's really to improve the EU regulatory framework on company law and on corporate governance. So companies will have to identify, prevent, and or mitigate adverse impact on human rights and environment. And examples are child labor, the exploitation of workers, and biodiversity loss. So it really aims to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior throughout global value chain. And the obligations are really on the actual and potential adverse impact for companies and their own operation and value chain. So who's in the scope of this directive? So it's EU and non-EU companies. So just to mention that this content is from the Commission proposal. As you will see on the next slide that there are very diverging opinion on this text, and so we might not see the final version as it is on the slides here. So the scope, the group one is like companies with more than 500 employees and a net turnover of over 150 million euros. And the group two is more than 250 employees and a turnover of over 40 million euros. So if half of their turnover is in a sector considered as high risk, and food products are highlighted as a high risk sector. SMEs are not in the scope of the due diligence directive, but we do expect a spill-on effect on those actors as well. The text does foresee accompanying measure to help companies, including SMEs, that may be indirectly affected. So through different tools like guidance, help to companies in third countries, maybe potential financial support. And the idea is that it would enter into application for the companies in the group one after 2 years, and for the group 2 after 4 years. Here, as mentioned, it is really difficult to know this text is going to look like in the end, because there are diverging opinions. So already between the institutions, so if we take the example of the application, so in the European Commission proposal, it's 2 years from the entry into force for the group 1, while the council, so the member states, have a phase-in approach. So 3 years from the entry into force for companies with more than 1,000 employees and 300 million turnover. In the European Commission, they talk about value chain, so upstream and downstream activity up to the disposal of the product, while the council talks about chain of activities, so it's the upstream activities and in a limited manner downstream. So it's already very different. The council also defines better like the risk-based approach and promotes this one, and has better definition for civil liability and how to expect it. So we can see that between those two institutions, there are already different aspects. And from the first report in the European Parliament, in the jury committee, there would be like a third column with different definition and aspects as well. So they will really have to negotiate on that text. And then there's actually also some conflicts within those institutions. So in the European Parliament, this is why it took so long, because the political groups do not agree on the text and on some of the aspects. And in the Council, it was the same. Member states did not agree, and this is why it's considered as a lenient text that they came up with. So for this one, it's really difficult to specify a precise timeline and to see if it's going to be adopted before the end of the term. This is the objective. So let's see if, because next year there will be elections in the European institutions. So they're really pushing to have all those initiatives approved and adopted before the end of the term. But let's see with this one, how it will work. And then last but not least, there's like a proposal for regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labor on the union market. So this initiative was first referred to in the State of Union in 2021, and it was already mentioned in the CS3D directive proposal. And you might ask, if child labor is yes, forced labor, child labor is already covered in the CS3D, why do we need another initiative? And this is why, because in the CS3D, so it's only some companies that are targeted. And in the end, if there's no possibility to mitigate the adverse impact, disengagement is the last resort. And although it does provide also some sanctions in case of non-compliance, it still does not require member states to prohibit the placing of the product on the market. So this is why they wanted to have another initiative to really cover the product and to have a product ban if needed. So this was published in September 2022. In the European Commission, it's a joint initiative under two directorates general. And in the Parliament, it's also a joint initiative between two committees. So it's internal market and consumers and international trade committees in the Parliament, and trade and growth in the European Commission. So the objective is really to prohibit the placing of products made with forced labor, because they consider that existing initiatives cover economic operators, such as large companies, or some sectors, as in the deforestation one, with the 7 commodities that are targeted only. So it's all products made in the EU market for domestic consumption, exported, and also imported products. So there's no specific company or industry targeted. The focus is really on the product. The definitions are in line with the International Labour Organization definition, And it does include definitions on forced child labor as well. So forced labor and forced child labor are included in the text. And there are other standards that they refer to in the text as well. So in this case, it's national authorities that will have the power to withdraw from the EU market products made with forced labor following an investigation. So they really stress this risk-based enforcement approach. The only issue is that as the product might already be on the market when they do finalize the investigation, you might have to recall the product from the shelf, which makes it more complicated as well. And the application would be 24 months after the entry into force. So this is the text as proposed by the European Commission. So now it has been referred to in the European Parliament and the Council, and it will have to be discussed internally in those two institutions. And then as for the other pieces of legislation, it will have to enter trilogue negotiations to try to find a compromise text. So this was the presentation on the three pieces of legislation. I hope it was clear, and if you have any questions at the end, please feel free to say so or contact me afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel. It's over to you now, Janina.
Sure, absolutely. I'll just start sharing my screen. And so I was asked to provide a couple of potential scenarios or how this could play out based on experiences that we've had in other types of sectors. And I think I'll jump directly to that, given that we're a little bit short on time. So just again, as Isabel has explained so comprehensively, what are the requirements of companies in these upcoming regulations or directives? We'll need a lot more traceability of products down to the plot level in the case of the deforestation regulation, a lot more transparency across the supply chain, much greater knowledge, or like at least very good knowledge of suppliers and potential issues that might be in the supply chain to provide support in improving such conditions, and also accountability for harms done, especially if it was harms by the company or subsidiaries, as in the case of the due diligence directive. And so I wanted to point out that especially in the coffee sector, which is very much many countries smallholder based, this, of course, while smallholders are not in the scope of this legislation, will have a lot of implications for them as well. They may be asked for much more traceability and information systems on the ground. They will need to be engaged on issues of concern, including child labor, remuneration of farm workers. So this would be sort of the larger human rights or environmental due diligence issues. They may be empowered, especially if harms are occurring to them because of multinational companies, but they may also be excluded from the supply chain as we're moving into this new reality of needing to have a lot more information. And so I wanted to give us sort of a perspective from a sector that has already grappled a lot with these issues, namely the palm oil sector, to provide potential scenarios or ways forward on how companies and other actors in the sector might arrange themselves with these new legislations. And so here, this is based on research work that I've done over the last 4 years on the implementation of zero deforestation commitments in the palm oil sector, which were voluntary, which were responses to civil society action. A number of midstream and downstream companies pledged to make their palm oil supply chains deforestation free by 2020 and implemented internal supply chain, like supplier codes of conduct and other types of policies on this. The palm oil, this is not only the case in palm, but also other deforestation risk commodities, such as beef cattle or soybean, but palm actually had much greater adoption of these types of commitments, especially in Southeast Asia. And so there was a large enough number of companies that there's actually movement on the ground. And so what we see in this sector is a decade of experimentation. Basically, they have a little bit of a head start to understand how a very complicated supply chain can be made more traceable and more transparent. And so I'll just share a couple of experiences of different types of company approaches that others have taken, and to explain how this could be applicable to coffee. So the first scenario, right, is about the minimization of risks and the simplification of supply chains in response to actually, so here the idea would be, okay, our supply chain is too complicated. Let's focus down on very few suppliers that have good practices and continue working with them much more comprehensively. This is a strategy that Mars, for instance, took when it made its zero deforestation commitment in the palm sector. They used to buy from all over Southeast Asia and Indonesia more than 1,500 mills, which are these first aggregation points, and they whittled them down to less than 100 with the goal of going even further down to only 50 mills by 2022. And they really focused on this idea of having a one-to-one-to-one model. So one plantation, one mill, one refinery, very much these individual traceable flows of commodities. And we're one of the only companies that were able to say by 2020 that we have reached this goal of having a fully deforestation-free supply chain. However, they were then also under some criticism by saying, well, you haven't actually contributed to solving the problem because you just moved your supply to the areas that don't have any problems to begin with. So there were critiques that they were excluding smallholders, excluding areas or suppliers that had lower capacities of compliance. And so it was not a complete win-win, especially for this voluntary commitment. And so there might be the possibility that if other actors in these upcoming legislative developments pursue similar strategies to have similar types of critique. If a number of companies go for this type of approach, we could see a lot more competition over plantation coffee and coffee from advanced cooperatives that have good traceability systems. We may also see political opposition from countries that have a little bit less transparent or less easily legible sectors, as we would see, again, a movement away from those areas, at least when sourcing for the European market. Scenario 2 is that individual companies see this deforestation-free product as a competitive advantage and make heavy investments into their own supply chains in order to actually be one of the first ones or the best ones at producing a fully traceable deforestation-free supply that also is still inclusive of smallholders. And so have this sort of reputational advancement, right? We see a number of companies in palm doing this. Foremost, Golden Agri Resources, they've invested a lot in really like working together with also informal intermediaries and doing a lot, employing these technical support organizations to go around on the ground, plot different producers' farms, and enter them into these centralized systems for them. So this is sort of this like single company policy. In different types, in coffee, we also see a number of companies that do this on a small scale with blockchain technologies, right? And so this would really be the idea of having this like fully traceable, down to the ground supply chain. Of course, the challenge here is that, especially with smallholders, they may move in and out of your supply chain quite a bit unless you really change the way sourcing happens, move towards longer term contracts or really much more intense and in-depth relationships with those suppliers. So making sure that the database that is being drawn from is accurate and up to date, such that like risk is being reduced might be a challenge. And also having the ownership of the data that is then harnessed by single companies, right? This is like information of farmers, where they are, where their land is, what their production methods are. Having this being held by a single company may also provide some concerns around data ownership and making sure that the farmers whose data is being collected actually benefit from this in some way, should be high on the agenda. And of course, if this is really something that individual companies build on to build a competitive advantage, we may see a lot of duplication and a lot of fatigue by producers of providing the similar information again and again. We also have seen a number of companies in the palm sector deciding that this individual traceability efforts is not for them because of the challenge of making sure that this is really reflecting the realities on the ground. And so Mouse, for instance, is a company that has said, well, what we will do is we will move to the village level and really have a little bit more of an aggregated perspective on traceability and treat individual village as our unit of sort of concern and work with individual villages to decrease and reduce deforestation. There's also a number of jurisdictional or landscape initiatives that have taken the same approach of trying to have a more aggregate sustainability sort of level at a subnational level, and where then individual actors are working together with subnational governments, with NGOs, and also maybe even with other sectors beyond that particular commodity to try to reduce deforestation rates on the ground. Here, first of all, I should note that that level of traceability is not enough according to the legislative text right now, right? The legislative text is very clear that it needs to go to the plot level. So if this were a scenario that multiple actors are moving or preferring into, there may need to be some lobbying to adjust the interpretation of what is legislative compliance. Also, if we're thinking about the problem of actually solving or eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, there might be quite some collective action problems if we're really focusing on regions, because then we might be punishing producers that have done nothing wrong because there's individual bad apples in their midst, or we may also misattribute deforestation drivers if there's alternative sectors that are actually driving this. So it becomes a little bit complicated in actually reducing the deforestation, but maybe a little bit more feasible or in line with the status quo when it comes to this traceability. Then one thing that I've seen in the sector that's actually been quite informative is that a number of companies have said, okay, let's come together, collaborate in order to minimize costs and minimize the duplication of efforts to share information on traceability, on what is actually being done in the field to educate, train, and improve suppliers, and also share information across the sector on what is sort of the state of sustainability of the flows of commodities. And so in particular, the Action for Sustainable Derivatives, which is run through the Business for Social Responsibility group, they do this where they act as a clearinghouse for traceability information. So they're basically acting on behalf of very downstream cosmetics companies that find themselves confronted with a very complex supply chain, and they work then together to provide traceability data for these actors. And I could see this working in the sector maybe more on a localized level, working with local coffee boards or national government stakeholders to actually work together, try to help them map out different production locations and have sort of a centralized, unified data platform that different actors can draw upon to prove their traceability and prove that things are legal and well done. Again, the data ownership challenge comes in here again. Maybe if national actors are involved in this, there's a way to actually make sure that producers are benefiting from the system. In other types of collaboration, I've also always seen cost sharing that becomes an issue, and also guaranteeing accuracy. And also I put pre-competitive in quotation marks because it really always depends on what level different actors are at, whether something is pre-competitive or not. So this scenario, I could imagine, is much more pre-competitive for roasters than maybe for trading houses who do compete on the ground over supply of production and over actually information on different types of production practices. And I also just wanted to mention that one could imagine, and I have heard people that have imagined a scenario of trying to just achieve compliance at the lowest cost possible. And of course, one could imagine that in the face of this almost impossible task, people go to trying to find GPS points that are somewhat related to the production location, that are maybe not exactly from the location where the coffee is actually coming from, and sort of fudge compliance in this way to try to maintain the status quo of the sector. And of course, this has its own challenges attached to it, first and foremost, reputational, but also legal risk if this is actually being recorded and caught. And of course, doing this would also mean that there is no policy impact or goal attainment. And so I just wanted to put it out there that, of course, this is also something that we might imagine the sector moving towards, even if it's not the idealized outcome of this type of legislation. So what scenario will dominate collectively really depends on what actors are adopting, like who is going which way, who is collaborating with who is engaging with different types of government actors maybe on the ground. From a scientific perspective, what I would encourage is approaches that are inclusive and equitable, that are collaborative to reduce duplication of efforts, and also that are far-sighted enough, right? As Isabel explained, the deforestation regulation is not the only legislation on the horizon. And the European market is also not the only market that has more and more due diligence regulations coming up. So I think an approach that really contributes to sectoral transformation in the long run would probably be more foresighted than trying to sort of, change along the edges to meet these particular requirements while then having to adjust again for the next ones. So that's what I had to say. I also did want to say that this is an area that as a researcher, I'm very keen to understand better in the future. If anybody wants to chat more about this, I'd be really happy to do that as well. So with that, I think we do have some time for questions, both to Isabel and myself, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janina. So before we just go to questions, we've just put a poll up regarding Spanish translation. If everyone can just respond to that, because we just want to gauge if it's useful and if people are using it so that we know for future webinars. That would be really helpful. So I'm just going to open up the questions. We've got a few questions that I think are important and quite interesting. I think, Isabel, this first one's going to be to you. Somebody asks, are certifications like Rainforest Alliance already going to be a way to cover these new requirements? So basically, if the product is Rainforest Alliance certified, does it automatically is it automatically accepted by the regulation? I'll let you go into that.
Unfortunately, no. So you can use the information from your certification scheme to comply with the regulation, but this does not absolve you from your responsibility. So you might have to check if you have to add additional information or if it's sufficient. This is really up to you to assess to be able to comply, because you're the one responsible and you're the one who might be in infringement if you don't comply with the regulation. So if your certification scheme is really good for you, but I would check twice to make sure that it's compliant.
Great, thank you. There's another pretty technical question, and it's around the definition of SMEs and non-SMEs, which I think might also be for you, Isabel, but jump in, Janina, as well. So somebody asks, can you re-explain the differences in the requirements for SMEs versus non-SMEs? So what's the difference between these two? And then also, I mean, I think that they've also asked what's the requirement for SME operators and non-SME operators. So I think they mean the same thing. What is the definition of a SME?
So operators, we're talking about operators and SME or non-SME traders. So it's important to know that operators, if you're an SME, it doesn't change anything. If you're putting the product on the market, you're considered as an operator. And then you have to comply with like this information collection and depending on the risk of the country, the risk assessment and the risk mitigation. Now, the difference is more about the trader. So the one making available on the market. So when the product has already arrived on the EU market, and then there's a difference. So large traders are considered as operators. So you have the same obligations. Of course, you do not need to redo all the due diligence procedure as such, because you will receive the information in theory from the operator. So you will have the reference number in the system, but you still have to check the information. So it's important to check because it's really like a duty too. And if there's an infringement, you will be responsible. So it's considered as large traders have the same obligations as the operators. Now, SME traders have no due diligence obligation as such, except from the information collection. And so in theory, it's again, having the reference number from the operator or the previous actor in the chain, and to keep this information for 5 years. So it's more in that sense. So operator, like all the obligations mentioned, depending on the level of risk. And then for the trader, if it's a large one, kind of the same obligations. If it's an SME one, just information collection. I hope it's clear. I can go like with downstream operators as well, but it's make it complicated.
Yeah. So just on that note, we've had another question come in. So I'll keep us on that subject before asking a different question. Can you confirm that an operator is the company importing the goods on the EU market? So what's the definition of the operator?
So the operator is the legal or natural person, if I remember correctly by heart, but like placing the product on the EU market. So it's really the one that goes like through customs clearance. So this one is the operator. The trader is when the product is already on the EU market, like so that I hope, yeah. So it's like importing, it's like the operator.
Great. So we've got another question which I knew would come through. It's about the risk levels attributed to each of the origin countries. So somebody's asking here specifically what the risk level is for Brazil. But I think it would be useful if you could maybe explain that process of attributing risk levels to the countries.
So for now, we do not know about the risk level. So the Commission has to come up with the list by the entry into application. So in theory, end of 2024, early 2025. So at that time, the Commission will come up with the list. But now the Commission has started negotiating with producing countries to assess the level of risk. So some of those discussions I quite, how to say that? I mean, agitated, let's say. So producing countries are responding in different ways to the regulation. So some are more in favor of it than others. And so this is really a negotiation with the Commission and with the producing countries. So individually, they will assess the level of risk. And of course, the Commission's intention is to have as much low-risk countries as possible, but for now, it's really impossible to say which countries will be considered as low-risk, standard, or high-risk.
And Isabel, is it correct in saying that all origins will be at a medium risk level at the beginning? Is that correct?
Standard risk is like the default one. So when it enters into application, standard is the default, and then you have to adapt according to the benchmarking system.
Okay. Okay, so we've got quite an operational question. you know, I'm just going to pose it to you. Let me know if it's difficult to answer. But when the declaration must be submitted, each time coffee is exported, the declaration must be submitted. How often should the operator measure the risk of deforestation on farms? Is it every year with the declaration, or is it every shipment?
Every shipment. So every shipment will need its own due diligence statement. Okay.
Great, thanks. All right, another very tricky question. Maybe Yanini, you can jump in on this one.
Please.
It's about I think what's all on our minds is about the cost of data collection and the cost of mapping farms. This cost is going to be quite high. Everyone's going to need a digital system. We're all going to have to be processing and storing that data. This is probably going to increase the price of the product. Who's going to pay this cost? And the consumer. It'd be interesting to get your perspective on what you maybe saw from the palm oil industry and how that industry has dealt with the cost, and also maybe what you can imagine in the coffee industry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess who's going to pay the cost, right? Is that kind of a question that like the actors collectively will decide who will be able to take on more cost, or who will decide to pass it through. I guess in the end, it will be moving to the consumer in some way. But I think this is where trying to lower or limit the cost by not duplicating efforts is going to become, and collaborating with each other is going to become really important, right? And so again, one could imagine different types of scenarios also when it comes to mapping farms, that it may actually not be the trading company or the that is doing this work, but it's collaborating with others. It's collaborating with local governments who may also have an interest in actually making their coffee available to the market. So there might be cost sharing that is happening that then reduces the price. From what we've seen in palm, we did see that there's sort of identity preserved palm oil, which used to be the first one that was then fully traceable, that did have quite higher costs than the bulk palm oil. And this was then used by a small number of consumer goods companies in sort of more premium products. So I think that would be where the cost was passed on. But then as more and more companies actually made these pledges, and this is why I think it's quite unique in this case and useful that it is an industry-wide movement. Everybody has to move at the same time. The costs came down quite a bit. So actually making larger amounts of shipments, like moving them into the system, is cheaper than having very single like premium lines that have to be moved away from the mainstream. So hopefully with time, it'll be actually achievable at not too high costs for the consumer, and at costs that are not passed down to individual producers either, which is something that I would be concerned with.
Great. I think that's all we got time for, and we've answered everyone's questions. So thank you so much to everyone for joining. Thank you for your questions, and especially thanks to our speakers. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Nanina, for joining us. I just want to leave you with a quick reminder about our Italy Espresso tour in May. There's limited availability, so if you're interested to join us, we're going to be visiting some roasteries of Lavazza and Starbucks. So urging you to sign up, and you can do that on our website. Looking forward to seeing you all either on that trip or on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.